I never imagined I'd be seated at my parents' Thanksgiving table once more. Not after the events of 3 years prior. My name is Olivia Chen, and the last time I was in this room, my father had met my gaze across the assembled family. His voice, thick with contempt, labeling me a failure. Such a disappointment, he'd stated. The words echoing as conversations faltered and eyes dropped to plates. All that potential squandered on your pathetic job. That evening, I drove away, tears blurring my vision, vowing never to subject myself to that pain again. Yet here I was, observing my mother carefully position the roasted turkey on her cherished serving platter, while my father adjusted the thermostat in a house they didn't know I owned outright. 3 months ago, I had discreetly settled their entire mortgage. The mortgage on the very home they held in such high esteem, the house where they had publicly shamed me. As I sat, a knot tightening in my stomach, I wrestled with the decision. Reveal to them that their failure daughter was now their anonymous benefactor, or allow the secret to remain buried. The weight of this knowledge pressed heavily on my chest, watching them navigate a home unaware that every step they took was on ground I had silently secured for them. Despite everything said and done, my upbringing as the child of Chinese immigrants in suburban Connecticut profoundly shaped my identity and my understanding of success. My parents had arrived from Shanghai in the late 1980s with little more than 2 suitcases and academic credentials that held no currency in America.
They were forced to rebuild their lives from scratch while raising 3 children.
From my earliest memories, the message was stark. Education was the sole pathway to achievement, and only achievement could earn parental affection. My father, a former engineering professor who endured 15 years as a mid-level technician before finally securing a position commensurate with his expertise, funneled his frustrations into driving his children toward the success America had initially denied him. He would urge us to study until your eyes bleed, inspecting my homework with relentless scrutiny, tearing up papers for minor errors, compelling me to redo hours of work over a single mistake. My mother, softer in her approach, but equally committed to this vision, would comfort my tears privately while publicly endorsing my father's methods. She would whisper, applying cooling cream to my eyes, swollen from late-night calculus struggles, that he only wanted what was best for me. Our family home, a modest colonial they purchased after years of stringent saving when I was 10, represented their aspirations. Stability, respectability, the American dream finally within reach. My older brother, Michael, effortlessly met their expectations, becoming a cardiologist, marrying a Chinese-American dentist, and producing 2 academically gifted grandchildren already excelling in elementary school math competitions. My younger sister, Catherine, followed a similar trajectory, earning a law degree from Yale, her accomplishments prominently displayed on what my mother affectionately termed the pride wall in the living room. And then there was me. Initially, I was a star student, achieving perfect SAT scores and gaining early acceptance to Johns Hopkins for pre-med. The child destined to complete their immigrant success story triumvirate. The day my acceptance letter arrived was the only time I ever witnessed my father cry. His hand trembled slightly as he phoned relatives in Shanghai. "My daughter, the future doctor," he announced, his voice thick with an emotion he never expressed directly to me. Little did any of us realize then that I would become the family disappointment, the cautionary tale whispered about by relatives, the daughter whose framed achievements would gradually vanish from the pride wall as I deviated from their prescribed path toward a future they couldn't comprehend or value. The day I informed my parents from my dorm room that I was withdrawing from medical school marked the beginning of the cold silence that would come to define our relationship. I tried to explain, my voice trembling, describing the panic attacks, the daily dread of memorizing procedures that held no interest for me. I told them I'd been accepted into a business program focused on technology startups, that this was where my passion lay. The silence stretched so long, I feared the connection had been lost. Until I heard my father's measured breathing. He finally spoke, each word deliberate and sharp, stating I would regret this for the rest of my life. He insisted their sacrifices were not meant for me to abandon a respectable future for what he called some computer games. My mother then took the phone, pleading with me to reconsider, implying my father was heartbroken, though he wouldn't voice it. The first year after leaving medicine proved brutal. I shared a cramped San Francisco apartment with 3 roommates, worked unpaid internships while attending night classes, and watched my savings dwindle as classmates from affluent families attended exclusive events I couldn't afford. The first Thanksgiving, after what my father deemed my betrayal, set the pattern for subsequent years. My aunt politely asked about my work with computers at dinner. Before I could respond, my father interrupted, dismissing it as a temporary situation not worth discussing. When I attempted to explain my role assisting startups with business strategies, my mother swiftly shifted the conversation to my cousin's medical residency, proudly announcing her as top of her class, seemingly to underscore what constituted real achievement. That night, my brother Michael found me weeping in the backyard. He offered awkward advice to give them time, suggesting I had always been Dad's favorite and he simply didn't understand this new path. But time only deepened the rift. Each family gathering brought a new iteration of the same humiliation, pointed inquiries about my return to a real career, uncomfortable silences when I mentioned small professional victories, relatives who once sought my advice, now directing their questions to my siblings. When Peter, my boyfriend of 2 years, finally met my family and witnessed their treatment, something shifted in our relationship. He questioned how I could tolerate their behavior, stating they spoke to me as if I were worthless. 3 months later, he ended things, citing my family issues as a factor. The rejection was painful, but it also forged a new resolve within me, a determination to succeed not despite, but almost because of my family's disapproval. I plunged into my work, volunteering for undesirable projects, staying up late to learn programming languages, networking relentlessly at industry events where I was often the sole Asian woman. Gradually, I forged meaningful connections, impressing mentors who valued my analytical skills and business instincts over my discarded medical aspirations. Yet, each small victory felt incomplete without my family's acknowledgement, and every visit home reopened wounds that never fully healed, leaving me in a peculiar state of being an immigrant child, unable to fully embrace my new life while still craving approval from the one I had left behind. My career trajectory dramatically shifted the day I met Sarah Bennett at a Women in Tech conference, where I had volunteered to save on the entry fee. Tall and confident, with a reputation for transforming struggling startups into desirable acquisition targets. Sarah approached me after her keynote speech. She remarked that my question about scalable infrastructure was the only intelligent one asked, bluntly asking what I was doing serving coffee when I should be presenting. 2 weeks later, I joined her team at Vision Scale, a startup developing AI solutions for supply chain management. Perhaps not the glamorous tech job outsiders envisioned, but one with significant growth potential. For the first time, I worked under someone who challenged me based on my capabilities, not to fulfill some predetermined expectation. Sarah noted during my first performance review that I possessed a unique perspective, thinking like an engineer, but communicating like a natural leader, a rare combination. My salary doubled within 6 months as I progressed from analyst to project manager, overseeing teams, developing solutions for Fortune 500 clients. The first time I received a bonus check with more zeros than I had ever seen in my bank account, my initial impulse was to call my parents, certain this tangible proof of success would finally earn their approval. Instead, I contacted my therapist, Dr. Winters, whom I had started seeing after the breakup with Peter. She observed that I had been conditioned to seek validation exclusively from them, suggesting I explore celebrating this achievement on my own terms. That evening, I purchased an expensive bottle of wine and made a private toast to my own resilience on my apartment balcony overlooking the bay. When Vision Scale began preparing for potential acquisition, Sarah shared life-changing news. As an early employee with stock options, I stood to gain a substantial sum in the buyout. She advised me to educate myself about wealth management, as my financial situation was about to transform dramatically. I dedicated weekends to investment courses, connecting with financial advisors, navigating a world my immigrant parents had never prepared me for. A world where wealth derived not from decades of cautious saving, but from calculated risk and innovation. When the acquisition was finalized, I found myself at 31 with more money than my parents had accumulated in their entire lives. The bitter irony was not lost on me. The computer games career they had derided had generated more financial security in a few years than their esteemed medical path would have provided in decades. Through family gossip channels, I learned my parents were facing financial strain. My father's retirement planning had been inadequate, and the economic downturn had negatively impacted their investments. The mortgage, refinanced years prior to help fund my siblings' education, was becoming an unforeseen burden in their golden years. They maintained a facade of stability at family gatherings, while privately selling possessions and cutting expenses. Their predicament became acutely clear during a rare phone call with my mother when she mentioned they might need to downsize from the family home, the tangible symbol of their American success story. The house where, despite everything, I had experienced rare moments of belonging amidst the criticisms and expectations. 3 years ago, I had arrived at my parents' home for Thanksgiving, believing I finally had the key to bridging our divide. News of my promotion to Director of Strategic Partnerships at Vision Scale, accompanied by a feature about me in a respected industry publication. I had spent an absurd amount on hostess gifts, premium tea from my mother's hometown region, an expensive bottle of baijiu for my father, gourmet chocolates for the table. My hands trembled slightly as I rang the doorbell, mentally rehearsing how I would casually mention the promotion during dinner, foolishly envisioning my father's grudging pride, perhaps even an acknowledgement that my chosen path had merit. My mother answered, her initial critical assessment of my appearance immediate, though unspoken. The designer dress I'd bought seemed impractical, my professional haircut overly effortful. She stated I was late, though I was precisely on time, adding that everyone had already arrived. Inside, the house buzzed with the familiar tension of extended family gatherings. Aunts bustled in the kitchen, uncles debated politics in the living room, cousins showcased photos of their children and spouses. My brother Michael offered a cool nod from across the room. His picture-perfect family assembled around him. My sister Catherine immediately cornered me with wedding planning questions, her recent engagement the current focal point of parental approval. She whispered a warning that Dad was in a mood due to a furnace issue the previous day, and advised against mentioning work. But avoidance proved impossible. As we finally gathered for dinner, my father, presiding at the head of the table, performed his annual ritual of soliciting achievement updates from each child. Michael recounted a complex procedure he had pioneered. Catherine announced her elevation to partner at her law firm a year ahead of schedule. When my turn came, my father's gaze bypassed me, settling on my cousin Stephen, whom he addressed, commenting on his surgical residency nearing completion. I cleared my throat and stated I also had news. My company had been acquired, and I had been promoted to director level. A brief, uncomfortable silence ensued before my father snorted dismissively, asking, "Director of what? Computer games?" My mother nervously laughed, suggesting I had always been creative with titles. Something inside me snapped. I stated clearly that it was not a made-up title. I led a team of 30 people developing AI solutions for global companies, and the promotion included stock options worth a significant amount. My father's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the dishes. He declared he'd had enough. He accused me of abandoning a respectable medical career for this playing around with computers. He contrasted me with my cousin Stephen, who would save lives, my brother, who improved hearts, my sister, who protected rights. What value, he demanded, did I contribute? His voice rose with each word. His face flushed with a mix of disappointment and genuine bewilderment. All that potential, all their sacrifices, he lamented, for what? So I could hold a fancy title at a company no one had heard of? He concluded, declaring me a failure, a complete disappointment. The table fell silent. My aunt stared at her plate. My cousin Stephen examined his fingernails. No one came to my defense. Not my siblings, not my mother, who looked away with embarrassment, not the relatives who had once celebrated my science fair victories with genuine pride. My father delivered the final, deepest cut, invoking the memory of his own father, the man who had encouraged my early interest in mathematics, the only family member who had ever loved me unconditionally. Your grandfather would be ashamed, he stated. I stood up so abruptly, my chair toppled backward, crashing against the hardwood floor. Excuse me, I managed, my voice strangled, before grabbing my coat and purse and stumbling toward the door as my mother weakly called after me. In my car, parked 2 blocks away, to evade my father's inevitable criticism of my parking, I finally broke down, racked by ugly, gasping sobs that ruined my carefully applied makeup. The humiliation burned like acid, stripping away the last vestiges of hope that my family would ever recognize my worth. Through tears, I observed happy families through lit windows, imagining Thanksgiving tables where children were not ranked by achievements, where parents celebrated individuality rather than conformity. Something crystallized within me that night, shivering in my car, a resolution that would shape the next 3 years. I would never again measure my worth through their eyes. I would construct a life so undeniably successful, by any metric, that they would be forced to acknowledge it. Not because I still craved their validation, but because I needed to dismantle their power over me once and for all. The weeks following that Thanksgiving became a paradoxical blur of professional ascent and personal collapse. During workdays, I functioned with mechanical precision, channeling all my hurt and rage into flawless presentations, strategic innovations, and ruthless negotiation tactics that impressed even our most demanding clients. Sarah commented, after I secured a lucrative contract our competitors had chased for months, suggesting I bottle whatever was driving me and sell it. Nights and weekends told a different story. Panic attacks that left me gasping for air at 3 a.m. Crying jags, triggered by mundane reminders of family. A pervasive sense of unworthiness, untouched by external success. I finally heeded Dr. Winter's long-standing recommendation to increase our sessions to twice weekly. She helped me unravel the complex interplay of cultural expectations, immigrant-parent dynamics, and personal identity crisis underlying my breakdown. Your father's rejection feels total, she explained during a particularly difficult session, because your entire sense of self was built around earning his approval. We needed, she emphasized, to help me build an identity that didn't require external validation from people who fundamentally failed to understand my choices. The acquisition of Vision Scale finalized in February, converting my stock options into tangible wealth that my financial advisor described as life-changing money. Suddenly, at 32, I possessed the financial security my parents had labored decades to achieve. The irony was not lost on me. The career path they had dismissed so thoroughly had yielded the very stability they had always preached as the ultimate goal. My initial impulse was to share this vindication, to force them to acknowledge I had succeeded on my own terms. But Dr. Winters cautioned against pursuing validation that might never materialize. She reminded me that their inability to value my path was a reflection of their limitations, not my worth. I limited contact with my family to brief text exchanges and declined invitations to Lunar New Year celebrations, focusing instead on cultivating connections that nurtured rather than depleted me. Then came the phone call that introduced a new complication. My mother, uncharacteristically vulnerable, asked if I could recommend affordable contractors for urgent home repairs. The roof was leaking, and the bank, she paused, her pride clearly warring with necessity, had not approved their refinance application. She added that with Dad's retirement, they no longer qualified. Additional details surfaced through family channels. My parents had refinanced their mortgage years prior to assist with my siblings' graduate school expenses, relying on continued employment that my father's health issues had prematurely ended. The house that symbolized their American dream was now at risk, though they carefully concealed this reality from relatives and friends. Through a series of discreet inquiries and one ethically dubious phone call, where I impersonated my mother to their mortgage servicer, I uncovered the full extent of their financial vulnerability. They were 3 months behind on payments. With limited retirement savings, after supporting my siblings and covering medical expenses not fully covered by insurance. One sleepless night, staring at my investment portfolio, a radical, perhaps self-destructive, idea took hold. What if I paid off their mortgage entirely? The sum, while substantial, represented only a fraction of my new wealth. My financial advisor was unequivocally against it. This was financially unsound and emotionally questionable, he argued. They had not supported my choices or acknowledged my success. Why would I do this? Why indeed? The question haunted me through meetings with attorneys exploring anonymous payment options, through conversations with a secondary therapist specializing in Asian American family dynamics, through meditation sessions attempting to distinguish healthy generosity from self-destructive people-pleasing. The answer arrived unexpectedly during a rare call with my brother Michael, who casually mentioned our father had begun skipping his blood pressure medication to save money. He had never admitted it, of course, Michael said. Mom had told him accidentally. They were both too proud to ask for help. Something shifted within me then, a recognition that beneath my hurt and their disappointment lay a simple truth. They were still my parents. Their limitations were products of their own trauma and cultural context. Their harshness stemmed from desperate love and fear, not malice. Their inability to understand my world didn't negate the sacrifices they had made to provide me with opportunities they never had. I could acknowledge the harm they had caused, while still recognizing the humanity behind it. After exhaustive research and legal consultation, I devised an elaborate plan involving a private banking service specializing in anonymous major transactions, enabling me to settle their mortgage completely without revealing my identity. The explanation crafted for my parents was intentionally vague: a mortgage forgiveness program targeting retirees of their demographic in their specific zip code, randomly selected from qualifying households. Executing the payoff demanded more subterfuge than any corporate negotiation I'd ever managed. The banking service I chose specialized in high net worth individuals requiring privacy, but even they seemed perplexed by my insistence on total anonymity. Clients usually seek recognition for their generosity, the private banker commented, sliding the final paperwork across his polished desk. Your parents will never know who did this. I signed the documents with steady hands, the culmination of weeks spent gathering account numbers, verifying property details, and creating a financial labyrinth designed to baffle even the most determined investigator. That, I replied, was precisely the point, wondering if he perceived the contradiction in my eyes, the desire to simultaneously punish and protect the people who had wounded me most deeply. The actual transfer occurred anticlimactically on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a product development meeting. My phone silenced as funds moved and documents processed. By Wednesday morning, my parents' mortgage company had received full payment for the outstanding balance, including penalties and fees. The paperwork informing them would arrive via certified mail within 5 business days. Explained as part of a limited community reinvestment initiative, language carefully crafted by the bank's legal team to sound plausible without promising similar forgiveness to others who might inquire. For days afterward, I started every time my phone rang, half expecting my father's suspicious questioning or my mother's tearful gratitude, but the call never came directly. Instead, the news filtered through family channels. My sister Catherine called first, describing something strange happening with mom and dad's house. A letter stating their mortgage was completely paid off through some banking program. Dad thought it was a scam, and they were consulting an attorney the next day. I feigned surprise, asked appropriate questions, and promised to look into similar programs. The following week, my mother texted our family group chat. Good news confirmed. House payment gone. Banking program for seniors in our area. Very fortunate selection. Dad says, don't tell outside family yet until all paperwork final. The carefully neutral language could not conceal the relief, evident even in text form. Through occasional calls with my siblings, I pieced together the aftermath. My parents' initial suspicion gave way to cautious celebration. My father researched obsessively for signs of fraud before finally accepting this change in fortune. My mother cried as she shredded the budget worksheet where she had been calculating which bills to pay late each month. My brother reported our father had resumed taking his medications regularly. My sister mentioned our mother had finally scheduled the knee surgery she had postponed due to cost. These snippets of their improved daily life brought complicated satisfaction, pride in my ability to help, bitterness that they would never know to thank me, relief that their basic security was assured, and anger that they had never supported the career that made this possible. With their most pressing financial worry eliminated, my parents' social life expanded. They hosted more family gatherings, resumed community activities. My father even rejoined his beloved traditional Chinese music ensemble that practiced in the living room of the now secure family home. Through distant observation, via social media and family reports, I watched them reclaim joy in small ways, all while remaining completely unaware that their failure daughter had made it possible. Then came the text I hadn't anticipated. My mother extending a Thanksgiving invitation with unusual warmth. We missed you last year, it read. Your father asks specifically if you will come. The message contained no apology for past treatment, no acknowledgement of the rift, just this simple indication that perhaps my absence had been noted after all. Dr. Winters helped me process my conflicted response. She advised I could attend without expecting perfection, suggesting setting boundaries, bringing support, and preparing exit strategies if needed. When I mentioned I was seeing someone seriously, David, a user experience designer I'd met through work who knew my full family history, she suggested bringing him as both emotional support and a buffer, noting that having a witness could significantly alter family dynamics. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were filled with preparation, not just emotional readiness with Dr. Winters, but practical strategies with David, who approached the situation with the calm, problem-solving mindset that had first attracted me to him. He suggested we take separate cars, agree on a signal if I needed a break, stay at a hotel rather than their house, and leave the moment the environment became unhealthy. His willingness to protect my well-being without dramatic declarations deeply touched me. Here was someone who understood boundaries weren't about punishment, but self-preservation. As Thanksgiving approached, my anxiety manifested physically. Insomnia, stress rashes, a persistent knot in my stomach that tightened whenever I imagined walking through my parents' front door. Would they notice the external markers of my success? The subtle designer watch, the confidence in my posture, the healthy glow that had replaced the stressed pallor of my younger years? Would they finally see me clearly? And the question that haunted me most, If the conversation turned to their miraculous mortgage forgiveness, could I maintain my secret, or would some unconscious desire for acknowledgement betray me? While carrying the weight of my secret benefaction, I had simultaneously constructed a life increasingly disconnected from my family's narrow definition of success. Vision. Scales acquisition perfectly positioned me for my next career leap. Chief Strategy Officer at Terracode, a larger tech firm building infrastructure for sustainable urban development. The role brought public recognition my parents couldn't easily dismiss, features in business publications, speaking engagements at industry conferences, a compensation package that would have stunned them had they known its details. I maintained a careful separation between this flourishing professional identity and my family role as the disappointing daughter, never sharing articles where I was quoted as an expert, never mentioning awards or recognition, maintaining the fiction that I was still merely struggling in my computer games career. This compartmentalization extended to my growing circle of friends and colleagues, most of whom knew nothing of my family dynamics. Only David witnessed the occasional 3 a.m. anxiety spiral after a curt text from my mother or another invitation declined out of self-protection. He observed one night after talking me through a panic attack, triggered by a Lunar New Year card where my parents had addressed me with a childhood nickname that suddenly felt like mockery, that it was like I was two different people sometimes. The confident executive everyone else saw versus this wounded child still seeking validation they would never give. His observation stung with its accuracy. David's family presented a stark contrast to mine. His parents, retired teachers from Michigan, expressed uncomfortable amounts of affection, texted constantly with updates about neighborhood cats and book club selections, asked genuine questions about my work, and seemed baffled by the concept of conditional love. The first time his mother hugged me goodbye after dinner and simply said, "We're so happy David found you," I sat in my car afterward and cried from the simple acceptance I had never experienced from my own parents. Their easy integration of David into family gatherings highlighted the painful exclusion I had felt within my own. Our relationship deepened despite my lingering fears that family trauma had rendered me incapable of healthy attachment. When we moved in together after 18 months of dating, I finally shared the full story of the mortgage payment, something I hadn't disclosed to anyone except my therapist. We sat on our balcony, overlooking the bay, wine glasses in hand, as I detailed the elaborate financial choreography and my complicated motivations. His response reflected the thoughtful perspective I had come to value so deeply. He observed that I had done a genuinely kind thing from a complicated place, and that both things could be true at once. He paused, considering, then asked if I thought I would ever tell them. I had asked myself that question hundreds of times, imagining scenarios from tearful reconciliation to angry accusations of overstepping. I admitted I didn't know, that sometimes the secret felt like a source of power I wasn't ready to surrender, and other times like a burden I couldn't set down until they knew. David didn't press for a resolution, understanding that some family wounds defied simple healing narratives. Meanwhile, my limited contact with family continued through obligatory birthday texts and occasional group calls, where I listened more than spoke. Through these distant connections, I learned my parents' retirement had improved considerably since the mortgage miracle. My father had joined a Tai Chi group. My mother had taken up watercolor painting, and they had even managed a modest trip to visit relatives in Shanghai. My brother Michael, during a rare one-on-one call, mentioned our father had started speaking about me differently in my absence. He'd seen my name in a technology magazine at his doctor's office, and though he didn't say much, he had kept the magazine. This small acknowledgement shouldn't have mattered. I had long since stopped measuring my worth through his recognition. Yet, some stubborn, childish part of me stored this information like a precious stone, taking it out to examine in private moments. As another Thanksgiving approached, I found myself at a crossroads. both professionally and personally. Terracode was positioning for potential acquisition, which would trigger another significant financial event for me as a senior executive. David and I had begun tentative conversations about engagement, his patient understanding gradually dismantling my fears of bringing my family baggage into marriage. And the most unexpected development, my father had begun reaching out directly. Awkward text messages about weather and Chinese holidays evolved into brief inquiries about my work, never apologizing for past treatment, but demonstrating an unfamiliar attempt at connection. When my mother's Thanksgiving invitation arrived, followed by an unprecedented personal text from my father, "Your place will be set at the table. We hope you will fill it." David and I spent a long evening discussing whether attendance represented healthy reconciliation or self-destructive pattern repetition. He promised he would be with me, whatever I decided. His steady presence, the foundation that made me brave enough to consider returning to the scene of my deepest humiliation. Carrying a secret that had simultaneously liberated and burdened me for nearly a year. The drive to my parents' house on Thanksgiving morning felt surreal, as if I were simultaneously 35 and 22, a successful executive and a perpetually disappointing daughter. David followed in his car behind mine, our agreed-upon backup plan should I need a rapid exit strategy. The neighborhood seemed smaller than I remembered, the once impressive homes now appearing modest compared to the upscale condo David and I shared in the city. My parents' house stood exactly as it had 3 years ago. The same carefully tended shrubs, the same burgundy front door, the same seasonal wreath my mother likely purchased from the same craft store sale she had patronized for decades. Only I had changed, arriving not in the desperately purchased outfit intended to impress, but in simple elegance that reflected authentic success rather than straining to project it. My hand hesitated briefly before ringing the doorbell. The weight of the Cartier watch on my wrist, a tangible reminder of how far I had traveled from the weeping woman who had fled this doorstep 3 Thanksgivings prior. My mother answered, her reflexive, critical assessment visible in her first glance before registering genuine surprise at my appearance. "Olivia," she said, her voice carrying a note I couldn't immediately interpret. "You look healthy." In my family's emotional lexicon, this constituted effusive praise. The interior smelled of familiar holiday scents: ginger, star anise, the particular blend of my mother's Chinese cooking tradition mingled with American turkey. Family members were already gathered, clustered in conversations that paused briefly to acknowledge my arrival, expressions ranging from curiosity to weariness. My father emerged from his study, moving more slowly than I remembered. The past 3 years suddenly etched in his stooped posture and thinner frame. His customary stern expression flickered with something unfamiliar as he approached. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the closest approximation to warmth his reserved nature could manage. "You came," he stated simply, his handshake formal, but lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary. The introductions, when David arrived minutes later, proceeded with painful correctness. My parents visibly assessed him with the particular scrutiny they reserved for potential family additions. His easy confidence and respectful, but unintimidated demeanor clearly surprised them, especially when he responded to my father's questioning about his background in fluent Mandarin, a skill he had been secretly developing over the past year, specifically for this meeting. "Your young man speaks our language better than you do now," my father commented, the criticism automatic but lacking its usual sting. The initial hours passed in carefully orchestrated conversations, family members testing the boundaries of our fragile truce. My mother proudly showed David photo albums that pointedly excluded my college graduation and adult accomplishments. My aunt inquired about my computer job with the same condescending tone she might use to humor a child's fantasy. My siblings maintained diplomatic neutrality, years of navigating family dynamics, making them cautious intermediaries. The careful equilibrium shattered during dinner preparation when my mother mentioned the recent completion of long overdue kitchen renovations, prompting my aunt to comment on their good fortune with the mortgage situation. Such a blessing from heaven, she proclaimed, helping arrange serving dishes. Lynn and Edward worked so hard for that house. The bank forgiveness program was karma returning their good merit. My father, uncharacteristically emotional, added that after working his entire life, he had feared losing their home in retirement, and this miracle had saved them from shame. The conversation continued around the mysterious banking program, relatives speculating about selection criteria and whether connections through community organizations might have influenced their selection. David caught my eye across the room, his expression posing a silent question I wasn't ready to answer. As dinner began, the familiar ritual of achievement accounting commenced. My father invited each child to share accomplishments since our last gathering. My brother detailed his department's research publication. My sister announced her successful argument before a federal appeals court. When my turn came, the table fell into expectant silence, the ghost of my last disastrous Thanksgiving announcement hanging palpably in the air. I began cautiously, sharing only the most basic outline of my professional advancement, watching my father's face for the dismissal I had grown to expect. Instead, he listened with uncharacteristic attention, asking a surprisingly informed question about artificial intelligence applications. The conversation progressed through dinner with a strange new dynamic. My parents neither praising nor criticizing my choices, simply acknowledging them as legitimate. This tentative peace held until dessert, when my father, perhaps emboldened by 2 glasses of wine, made the comment that cracked my carefully maintained composure. He stated that Olivia had done better than we expected, with her unconventional choices, describing it as not traditional success, but adequate in its own way. The backhanded compliment ignited something in David, who set down his fork with deliberate calm. He inquired, with deceptive politeness, what my father meant by traditional success and adequate, noting that from his perspective, my achievements seemed rather extraordinary by any metric. My father waved dismissively, suggesting that perhaps in American business, but in their culture, certain professions held greater value and stability. The conversation might have continued in this vein. Another variation of the same dismissal I had experienced for years, except for what happened next. My mother, attempting to change the subject, mentioned their upcoming trip to visit relatives in Shanghai, noting it was the first time traveling freely without mortgage worry, adding that the banking program was a heaven-sent miracle. Something in her genuine gratitude, combined with my father's continued minimization of my accomplishments, even after years of evidence, crystallized a decision I hadn't consciously made. It wasn't a banking program, I stated quietly, the words hanging in the sudden silence as all conversation halted. My father's forehead creased in confusion. He asked what I was saying. David's hand found mine under the table, a silent support for whatever came next. Taking a deep breath, I continued, explaining there had been no random selection, no community reinvestment initiative. I had paid off their mortgage the previous year, all of it. The silence deepened as understanding dawned across different faces. My mother's hand flying to her mouth, my father's expression cycling through disbelief, suspicion, and stunned recognition. He finally managed, "That's not possible. You work in computers." The dismissive phrase that had diminished me for years now struck me as almost comical in its inadequacy. I confirmed that yes, I worked in computers. I was the chief strategy officer at Terracode, and before that, a senior executive at VisionScale when it was acquired. My stock options from that acquisition alone were worth more than he had earned in a decade. The bluntness of the statement caused a collective intake of breath around the table. The pathetic job he had mocked at our last Thanksgiving, I continued, had made me wealthy enough to pay off their house without significantly impacting my finances. My voice remained steady, not triumphant or angry, but simply stating facts long kept hidden. Their failure daughter, I concluded, had made sure they wouldn't lose their home in retirement. The aftermath of my revelation unfolded in waves of emotion around the table. My mother's silent tears, my father's rigid posture as he processed this inversion of our power dynamic, my siblings' wide-eyed realization that the family narrative had forever changed. No one spoke for several long moments until my father did something I had never witnessed in 35 years. He removed his glasses, set them carefully on the table, and covered his face with both hands. When he lowered them, his expression held a vulnerability I had never been allowed to see. "Why?" he asked simply. "After how we treated you, why would you do this?" The question contained multitudes: acknowledgement of past harm, bewilderment at undeserved generosity, the fundamental confusion of a man whose worldview couldn't accommodate such a contradiction. David squeezed my hand under the table as I formulated an answer that had been evolving within me for 3 years. "Because you're my parents," I began, the simplicity of the statement belying its complexity. "Because regardless of our differences, you sacrificed everything to give me opportunities you never had. Because your house represents your American dream, and I couldn't bear to see you lose it, even when you couldn't see or respect mine." My mother rose unsteadily and circled the table to embrace me awkwardly, her typical restraint crumbling. "We were wrong," she whispered. Words I had never expected to hear, so wrong about everything. My father remained seated, cultural conditioning and personal pride warring visibly with emerging recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult truth. "In China, when I was young," he explained, "there was only one path to security. Deviation meant poverty or worse." He couldn't see that America offered different paths, because he had never fully believed in American promises. He looked directly at me, seemingly for the first time in years, and stated that my success shamed his narrow vision, not me. This was not a Hallmark movie resolution. Decades of harmful patterns could not dissolve in a single evening of revelations. As conversation cautiously resumed, old dynamics occasionally surfaced. My mother reflexively comparing my sister's conventional choices favorably to mine. My father questioning whether technology careers had staying power. But something fundamental had shifted. A first crack in previously impenetrable beliefs. As family members helped clear dishes, my father approached where David and I stood near the living room window. He attempted casual conversation that couldn't disguise his recalibration efforts, noting that my young man told him I had been recognized in my industry, that there were articles. This small expression of interest, not wholesale approval, but simple curiosity, offered a path forward, different from both total reconciliation fantasies and complete estrangement fears. I replied, matching his tone, that yes, I could send him some links. My aunt, overhearing, mentioned she would like to understand my work better to explain it to relatives in China. My brother admitted he had already looked up my company after seeing my name mentioned in a medical technology journal. These tentative connections were not dramatic declarations of remorse or instantaneous family healing, but rather the first careful steps toward genuine seeing across the chasm of different values and expectations. As the evening concluded, my parents walked David and me to our cars, the November air sharp with approaching winter. My father hesitated before asking the question that clearly troubled him most. "The mortgage," he asked. "Was it to prove something to us?" The old me would have either denied this complexity or used it as a weapon. Instead, I offered honesty. Partly, yes. I wanted them to know I had succeeded even without their approval. But also, I added, because I loved them, even when that love felt complicated by everything between us. He nodded slowly, processing this duality that his more binary worldview struggled to contain. We have much to learn, he acknowledged. The admission itself a seismic shift, and much to discuss, if I was willing. The drive back to our hotel with David allowed space to process the evening's emotional complexity. He asked if I was okay as city lights replaced suburban darkness. I answered truthfully that okay didn't quite apply. I was something more complicated, relieved, vindicated, exhausted, hopeful, realistic. He smiled at the nuance. One of countless reasons I had grown to love him, affirming that all those feelings were simultaneously valid. In the weeks following Thanksgiving, tentative new patterns emerged. My father sent articles about AI he had found interesting. My mother shared photos of her watercolor progress. Awkward but genuine efforts to connect across the divide of misunderstanding. I maintained boundaries while cautiously opening doors, sharing professional articles selectively, accepting an invitation to a Lunar New Year gathering while declining others that felt premature. The most profound change wasn't external validation finally received, but internal freedom from needing it so desperately. My worth no longer hinged on their recognition, allowing me to engage with them as flawed humans, rather than all-powerful arbiters of my value. When David proposed 3 months later, my first instinct wasn't to gauge my parents' potential response, but to evaluate my own readiness and desires. I accepted because our relationship embodied genuine partnership and growth, not because marriage represented another achievement box checked. Telling my parents over video call produced predictably mixed reactions. Enthusiasm about a wedding for community face-saving, concerns about cultural differences, questions about children and surnames. But beneath these expected responses lay something new. My father's gruff acknowledgement that David clearly saw my worth, perhaps the closest he could come to admitting he hadn't. Their imperfect efforts at change didn't erase years of damage or guarantee future enlightenment, but they offered a pathway to a relationship based on who we actually were, rather than who they had demanded I become. On particularly difficult days, when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, I remembered Dr. Winter's wisdom. Forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. It means freeing yourself from expecting people to be different than they fundamentally are. My parents would likely never fully understand my choices or celebrate my path with the enthusiasm they reserved for more familiar achievements. Cultural and generational gulfs would continue creating friction alongside genuine attempts at connection. True healing would require ongoing effort from all sides, over years, not miraculous transformation through a single grand gesture, but in paying off their mortgage without expectation of gratitude or recognition. I had paradoxically paid off a different kind of debt, the emotional mortgage of seeking validation from people constitutionally limited in their ability to provide it. I wonder now, looking back at our complex journey, what lessons other first-generation Americans might draw from my experience. Was severing financial ties and expectations the necessary catalyst for healthier boundaries? Could genuine transformation occur without such a dramatic confrontation? And for parents from immigrant backgrounds, what would it take to recognize the legitimacy of success models foreign to their experience? These questions have no universal answers, each family needing to find their own imperfect path toward mutual recognition. What's your experience with immigrant family expectations? Have you ever made a grand gesture to prove your worth, only to discover the most valuable proof was freeing yourself from needing to prove anything at all? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening to mine, and remember that sometimes our greatest success isn't measured by careers or bank accounts, but by the courage to define worth on our own terms, while still extending compassion to those who taught us its opposite.